Welcome back to another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Richard Thompson. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Antony Winkel, one of the Sunshine Coast's leading neurologists and a man redefining what it means to live and work with a balance in a field not known for either. We talk about the rapid evolution of brain science, the emotional toll of medicine, and the power of perspective that comes from seeing life and death up close. It's an honest, insightful conversation about purpose, progress, and perspective. All right. Let's get into it. Dr. Antony, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
You are one of the region's leading neurologists, and I'm intrigued as to what got you into that field and what drives you now in that field.
First, I'd point out it's a pretty shallow pool on the Sunshine Coast. It's easy to be the best neurologist if there's like two of you.
Oh, I feel sorry for the other guy or girl. Yeah.
Medicine's a pretty convoluted journey, probably a lot like law is, and a lot of your early experience is guided by people who take you under their wing. So for people who don't know listening to this, medicine in Queensland is a postgraduate course. So you do an undergraduate degree at uni where you have a great time and learn nothing. Then you do a medical degree, which for me was realising, oh crap, I don't know very much at all.
That's the undergraduate degree.
Yeah, so I did a science degree and then medicine. And then once you finish medicine, that's when you kind of get turfed into the hospital system, and you start off pretty broad, just as a dog's body junior doctor doing a bit of everything, and you rotate through different areas in medicine and surgery and emergency and other things. And then by the time you get 2 or 3 years out of uni, you get to pick your path if you're ready. And there's not necessarily any time pressure, but I worked out pretty quickly I wasn't going to be a surgeon, and there were aspects of general practice and emergency medicine that I really liked. But partway through my second year after uni, I got bumped up to a more substantial responsibility position for the first time in stroke unit. And it just seemed to click with the way my brain worked. So, the things that I'd liked in other areas I saw. So, it's a specialty area where things can be going along fine, and then all of a sudden there's an emergency and there's lots of stuff we can do in a hurry. But also there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the background where we can help people with stuff that other doctors and other people don't know much about. So it kind of satisfied me intellectually. And then through that journey of training, the further I got along, the more I felt neurology was the right path. Once you sort of decide you're going to be a physician specialty, so that's basically non-surgical internal medicine type specialties like cardiology and endocrinology and neurology, there's a big set of exams halfway through your training. And then once you do your exams, then you get to go into your little subspecialty niche. So that's the point where I got into neurology and started to develop my skills a bit more. And I was really lucky. I did most of my training initially in Queensland, but then when I came time to pull the trigger on neurology, I decided to go to Victoria. And so I had to fly down to Melbourne and sit in front of a panel of all the head neurologists in Melbourne and interview and try to charm them and weasel the position. And out of that, I got balloted to Geelong Hospital for the first year. And Geelong, for me, was a lot like the Sunshine Coast. It was a smaller community. The hospital was very friendly. Everyone worked well together. But it also just had this really nice air of, let's just see what's possible. And the answer to everything was always yes. How do we make it work? Whereas a lot of the attitudes you see in some areas in health, that costs too much money or that's too hard work. Let's just stick with the status quo. So I think I was lucky there that it sort of pulled me into a group of very enthusiastic neurologists who kind of pulled me under their wing and taught me a lot of stuff. And I keep in touch with a lot of them since. And then I had a little run through sort of big city Melbourne practice where I got to feel like I was practicing at sort of the major centres of the country and doing really highfalutin intellectual type stuff. And then when I came back to the coast, it felt like I was able to bring a niche of expertise that didn't exist at the time on the coast and help develop a service from the ground up, especially since I came back here in 2018, which was, 6 or 12 months after the big hospital at Kawana opened. So we had this big, shiny new $2 billion facility and needed bodies and skills to fill it. And so the timing just worked out really well. The stuff that keeps me in neurology now, I think, are the same things that keep everybody happy in their work. I think, although my wife would disagree, my work-life balance is pretty good compared to the cliche of doctors. I don't do much out of hours. I mostly work business hours. I get to see my kids in the morning and I get to see them in the evening. I don't miss too many major events. I have a mix of work that keeps me intellectually challenged and stimulated, and the field that I'm in, which is nerve and muscle problems primarily, is incrementing at a pretty rapid rate. So, conditions that were rapidly fatal in infancy just a decade ago are now almost curable, and those kids now live normal lives, and I get to see them in my adult clinics, whereas I never would have seen them in the past. It's sort of where things like cardiology were 30 or 40 years ago, when people were starting to develop better therapies for heart attacks and keeping people alive better. It's sort of where multiple sclerosis was 20 years ago, when the first sort of disease-modifying therapies came along. It just feels like I'm riding that wave of really exciting scientific advances.
With that rapidness of brain science development, what's one area that excites you the most?
Well, I guess it's driven mostly by my niche, so nerve and muscle disorders. So, I look after and diagnose all the motor neuron disease with the help of a colleague in particular. And that's an area where Fight MND and the MND associations have done huge work in recent years, making it a much more visible disease and raising a lot more money for research. And it feels like, although we're not quite there yet, there's some really exciting stuff coming, and it feels like we're on the verge of having a proper breakthrough. And I think in my practicing lifetime, that whole field is going to change. And similarly, muscular dystrophies and problems that you're born with that there previously have not been any good treatments for. We're involved in a couple of very early phase trials right now where the people who've come along have sort of had these trial therapies infused, and it's dramatically improved their muscle function and sort of switched off their disease. And so people with different types of muscular dystrophy coming for follow-up appointments saying, this is the first time in my life I can put the glasses away in the cupboard above the dishwasher, and this is the first time I haven't woken up with muscle pain, and I can lift my kids up, and I haven't been able to do that before. It's incredibly meaningful work, I think, and it gives me a lot of satisfaction to feel like I'm helping. I'm not just in the field, I'm helping push the field forward. I think that gives me a lot of satisfaction.
How accessible are those sort of advanced treatments? How is the accessibility to that to the general public at the moment?
Look, there are challenges, and one of the biggest challenges Australia has is 25 million people. We have about 800 neurologists, which is not the worst ratio in the world. Places, at a conference a month or two ago, and I spoke to a delegate from Myanmar, and they have 55 million people, and they have, I think, 44 neurologists. Right. So, we're not doing badly on the global stage, but compared to America, for example, with 300 odd million people, and they have about 18,000 neurologists, there's a lot of access issues, especially out of metropolitan cities. And there's a weird quirk in our field where neurologists are not known for being personable or engaging or liking people very much, or maybe not relating well to people.
Interesting.
But we also don't like being alone, and it's really hard to convince us to leave capital cities. So we like just sort of huddling together, ignoring each other. And so,
have you found that to be the case? Like stereotypically?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I constantly joke that we're the autistic specialty and we have to practice eye contact and all those kind of things. And
so this is growth for you coming on a podcast?
Yeah, you have no idea. Yeah.
So good. Well, very proud of you for that. Very proud of you. From your perspective, what's the biggest misconception that people have about neurology and I guess in your specialty?
I think one of the trickiest things we have is there's a lot of subtlety to it, and a lot of the symptoms that bother people the most, such as migraine, for example. So migraine's in the top 3 economic disruptors in Australia. It costs the economy more than almost any other neurological disorder just because you have a severe migraine, you can't go to work, you can't look after your kids. But the severity of symptoms often doesn't correlate very well with the severity of the disease. And one of the challenges we have as a profession is, especially when supply is a huge issue, how do we triage referrals to us in a compassionate way that also meets the hard realities of some of our conditions are rapidly progressive and fatal and really need our attention quick, versus a mother of 3 who's in the prime of their life and is debilitated by a disease that isn't going to kill them, but may not rank against something like motor neuron disease, that inequity of access to us and then inequity amongst our specialty of what conditions are more serious than others is really tricky. And it's always the case everywhere in medicine that people who have the least serious, in inverted commas, diseases often have the most severe symptoms and will be the squeakiest wheel and sometimes get the attention. And I don't have a good solution to that. It's something we grapple with all the time. And obviously, in an ideal world, we'd see everybody quickly
Totally.
and reassure those who need reassurance and treat those who need treatment. But it's very difficult for people who are struggling with often unexplained neurological symptoms that maybe their GP isn't comfortable to help them diagnose or manage, even if it's not urgent enough for us to jump in and help quickly. It's a big problem.
Is that a GDP issue or a GDP question with general medicine? Medicine generally and access to medicine generally to solve that problem, in the sense that the poorer the country, the longer the wait, or the limited access to the right specialist, and conversely, the wealthier the country, the greater access. But even in Australia, as you said, there has to be some triage to it.
Yeah, and there's always a balance. And obviously, I'm not a health economist, so I don't have any of the answers. But what seems to be increasingly clear over time is medicine's becoming exponentially more complex and diverse. And the old days where your local family GP would know a bit of everything and be able to manage most things are probably pretty much over, because there's just too much to know now. So I think GPs have a really challenging job. I think it's easily the most difficult specialty in medicine, and it's definitely not reimbursed or funded at any level of government in the way that it deserves, I think. And if we had, I don't know how the model could be improved, but in the ideal world, it would be easier to get into your GP and they would have less time pressure to spend some time with you and really dive into things and try to triage for us what's serious and what isn't. We're never going to expect generalists to understand the nuances of our specialty, but
That's not their role.
A lot of pressure on the health system is this weird paradox where specialists aren't as accessible as GPs are, but strangely enough, our reimbursement, especially through Medicare, is significantly more generous. So even though it takes ages to see us, when we see someone, we can often spend an hour with them and really go through everything in detail, whereas what they really needed was a good half hour with their GP 18 months ago, and that could have been sorted out.
Interesting. Obviously, GPs are private. They're private practice, most of them anyway. And so that's where the economies come into it, and 5-minute consults and...
Yeah, I honestly don't know how they do it. I mean, I feel like my job is challenging. I spend an hour with someone and I sometimes have no idea what's going on and need to do other things to work it out. I honestly don't know how my colleagues in general practice do it.
If you could fast forward 10 years, Anthony, what would you hope to have changed in your specialty, or how we treat conditions?
I think, in 10 years' time, success to me would probably be measured in 2 columns. One would be just, what impact have I had on the Sunshine Coast at improving access north of us? Because, when you head north from the Sunshine Coast, you'll find a single neurologist in Bundaberg in private practice, no one at the hospitals. And then you'll hit a small group of neurologists in Townsville, public and private, and then you'll find another little group in Cairns. And otherwise, there's none of us. And people who live in Bundaberg, Rockhampton, Mackay, all these places have to either hop on a plane and fly to Brisbane, or drive down and see us, or try to find a telehealth option. And a lot of our assessments rely on us putting hands on someone and testing muscle strength and looking at things. So I think in 10 years' time, if I can see that the Sunshine Coast is self-sufficient and patients no longer have to go to Brisbane for things like neurosurgery or more advanced sort of interventions that we currently don't have here, I'd be very happy. If our local department was full of the same personable bunch of people that I've currently been able to attract, I'd be very happy. And if we keep the autism to a minimum, that would be lovely.
That's the key component of it, isn't it?
It is. Plenty of eye contact in our department. That's the key. And I think if we could have a better service going into the north, especially for us, our closest neighbour being Wide Bay, Hervey Bay, Bundaberg, having some of our group, or at least helping that district look after its own and keep people closer to home, I'd be very happy. So, with my Director of Neurology hat, that would be success to me. From a personal perspective, I think in 10 years' time, I mean, my kids will have probably, my youngest will have just finished school. She'll have been sort of a year out of school at that point. My eldest will be a couple of years out. If they still want to hang out with me as much as they do at the moment, that would be the win. I mean, I think there's lots of things I'd like to check off professionally, but not at the cost of that.
Obviously, within your period of time, you've mentioned that the science or the evolution of neurology is going at an exponential rate.
Mm.
Is there a story? Is there a moment? Is there a personal story that hits home to you in terms of the benefactor of that?
I'm incredibly fortunate that in my field, I see people at their most vulnerable, and I think it's one of the things that's helped me get the most rounded perspective on life and what I actually want out of life is, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, or if you're, living in a massive house or you live in a box under a bridge. When you have some sort of terrible neurological thing happen, we're pretty much all equal. All humans are the same and we all want the same things. And particularly the spectrum of conditions I look after where people find out they actually have much less time than they thought, and the stuff that they'd worked their whole life towards so that they would then have time to do the things they wanted to do. Our priorities are just totally backwards. It feels like the clock runs out on us all much sooner than we'd like, and I'm constantly struck by the number of people who regret a lot of their time on this earth just grinding towards the wrong things. So I think that's given me a fairly healthy perspective on, and again, my wife would strongly disagree on that point, but I think it's helped balance me out a little bit that, there's a lot more to life than, your 9 to 5 and what car's in your driveway and those kind of things. Conversely, I've seen with the shift of therapies, particularly in the neuromuscular realm where, people with particularly muscular dystrophies, I met a guy with muscular dystrophy for the first time a few weeks ago, and he's known he's had this disease for 30 years and it's slowly progressive and he's doing okay, but it's a pretty crap disease. And we'd met for the first time and then I was giving him a rundown of some clinical trials that are available and what they might do and, whether he might be able to participate. And his wife just started sobbing because she was like, everyone's always just told us there's nothing we can do. He's just going to get worse. He's going to be in a wheelchair. He's not going to be able to do this, not going to be able to do that. And it's so powerful that for the first time there's a bit of hope. And the therapies aren't there yet. There's still obviously a lot of development and stuff to come, but it's, there used to be an old cliche in neurology that the neurologist would come in and say, diagnose and adios because there was nothing we could do, whereas it's suddenly shifting, which is quite nice. So, you get those little glimmers of hope with individual people where you make a real difference to what their future may look like.
Hey team, just popping in to say thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the episode, please take a second to like or follow the show and share it with a friend. It's the best way to help us grow and keep bringing you more great content. All right, let's get back into it. Let's pivot then and talk about work-life balance. One of the final questions I ask at the end is I'll steal it for now. From the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, walk me through a normal day in your life. I'm intrigued.
So our girls are 11 and 9. They love their bed, which means for me, I get up at 5:30 most mornings and we'll usually do some form of exercise and no one else will be up at that time. So I get sort of an hour and a half in the mornings where it's just me and I make myself a coffee and just get to sit with my thoughts and sometimes get a head start on the working day and sometimes just enjoy the serenity. I'm then just sort of in the, help the kids get up, get myself dressed, get ready for work and go. And I'm usually out the door at about 7:30 because I start work at 8 most days. My working day is pretty varied. Some days I'm in clinic all day. Some days I do a mix of administrative things and clinics. Some days I do research. And some days, as today, I'm looking after our inpatients in the hospitals. I'll go in and help support the junior doctors and see people who need senior set of eyes to look at them and help make sure everyone has plans and diagnoses and things like that. I probably didn't appreciate as a younger doctor how much administrative stuff I'd be doing and so probably segues into some of your topics for today, but the advent of AI and documentation and how that's helping some of medicine to get some time back has been really nice to see. Then there's the sort of non-patient contact things that I do. So, looking through referrals and trying to triage them according to clinical urgency. Again, with that caveat that we spoke about before, that there are some really deserving people who, for whatever reason, sometimes just have to continue to suffer and can't get to the top of the list. And then, reviewing scientific progress and literature is the other aspect of staying current. So, each week I have a recurring search on PubMed, which is one of the big medical evidence databases, and I sort of get a summary of all the new articles in journals relevant to my field and just sort of go through articles that are of interest through the week and try to keep up to date. Then I'm usually out of work by about 5 or 5:30. It's pretty rare for me to finish later than that, so I get home in a decent hour. I would love to say that I help with dinner preparations, but at that time of the evening with the kids the age they are, it's primarily just be the dad. My wife is a saint. She works way harder than I do, but she's often the chef in our household just so that I can have some quality time with the kids and give them a couple of hours of undivided attention. And then we eat dinner as a family. We always read together, and then my wife and I will tend to sort of lay with our kids for a bit while they go to sleep, especially as they've got older. The one downside to our current lifestyle is it probably cuts into the adult time that my wife and I get, so we don't get much, child-free adult conversation time, which is something we have to work to carve out. But I'm pretty lucky, really. And then, I'm in bed at a decent hour. I don't stay up too late. I don't have to do much work out of hours. I've got myself pretty balanced. I think that I can get most things done in my day.
It sounds like it's very intentional for you, your day. You set out with a level of intention that's what you've just described. Has that always been the case? There seems to be a stigma or certainly a reputation for medicine that it's not as controlled and is not as balanced, I guess. Is there a toll to that in your experience? Has there been a toll?
Yeah, I think part of it is my maturity and also my wife's influence, because she's, she doesn't sugarcoat it. If she thinks I'm working too hard and neglecting family life, she will well and truly tell me and pull me into line, which at times I've really needed. There have been parts of my career, particularly the phase where you have to sit exams to become a specialist, and that grind was pretty heavy. And I was very lucky that was just before we had kids. So
but you're working as well.
Yeah, working as well and studying. So, that was 80 to 100 hours a week for a good 12 months, which I'm endlessly grateful that my wife stuck around for that ride, because wouldn't.
But it would have been communicated at the time to say, "Oh, this is a future for us, right? Like this is going to be heavy for a year, but it'll be okay."
I think knowing that intellectually, though, is very different to the practicality of watching your partner just disappear into a study and not come out for hours and feel like you're
a widow.
You're not a partnership anymore until that's over.
That's very true.
And I guess the other aspect is, because I deal with such depressing things at times, I think it's just given me a different perspective that it's actually not worth it to work yourself to the bone and be at work at all hours, because next thing you know, your kids are grown up and they're out of the home and you're not seeing them all the time. And I don't want that for our girls or me. Many things in life. I mean, I don't know what your experience was with Ultraman and all of the incredibly high-level athleticism that you did, but I remember going through early university and coaching sport and doing other sort of not elite but higher level athletic endeavours. I remember looking around me and thinking, geez, all of these really elite people are quite psychologically damaged. Like I think people who work really hard are chasing something that they don't have inside themselves. And that was certainly true for me. And before I met my wife, I would easily classify myself as a workaholic. I was a junior doctor who'd always volunteer for extra shifts. I'd pick shifts up off colleagues. I'd go out of my way to spend 16 hours in the hospital because I thought it was making me a better doctor. And it might have been, but there was probably a bell curve there where I was starting to fall off the other end, where I wasn't any better as a doctor and I was just a worse human being and less well-rounded.
Diminishing returns.
That's right, yeah. So I think I've sort of pulled myself back, but it is very much a conscious effort, because I am still very prone to, I'll just say yes to everything. How can I make it work? How can I fit it in? And then,
When you speak to people, and I also find it's intentional and it's because of the people around you, but you're in a position at the moment to head neurology, to have the intentional life, to control that. To what level do you think that is because you were a workaholic, because you've advanced your career in such a rapid rate and learnt so much? Yes, the bell curve on the other side and all that, but the person who is 25 looking to find work-life balance as a junior doctor is probably not heading up neurology on the Sunshine Coast.
Yeah, that's probably true. And I mean, in many ways, I'm probably a giant hypocrite because I wouldn't be where I am without
All
a
that,
large chunk of work preceding it.
the unbalanced work.
That's right. I only know what balance is because I was so imbalanced. And so that's tricky. I mean, we are seeing that shift in medicine and probably society more broadly, though, that junior doctors are more reluctant to do the long hours that used to be done, and there's a bigger push for a better work-life balance. And even this week, we're discussing as a department we might have an extra body of staff next year to help out with sort of high acuity things in the hospital. And we were talking about, does that person work a normal day and just help take the load off the team, or do they work a slightly later shift and try to take some of the load off the day team, but also help the evening team out? And I was maybe not surprised in retrospect, but a lot of the junior doctors, when we put it to them, just said, look, I mean, service delivery is fine, but we don't want to be here until 7 or 8 at night, even if it means we're starting later. We want to just work a normal business day. We want to have the early morning to do things before work, and we want the afternoon to have a life and do things. And it's nice seeing that attitude shift come through.
You spoke about how you were searching in your junior years, or that you think there's a lack. Is that still the case? How have you dealt with, on a not mental health, but certainly a mindset shift of what drove you to work so hard and what has changed to be controlled now?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think in broad terms, I'm as flawed a human being as many of us are. And all. Yeah. I mean, I'm, perfectionistic traits. I like things being done really well. And, even thinking back to primary school, I was always that annoying kid who would, as part of the group project, I'd just be like, look, I'll just do most of it. Let's just, so there's obviously some inborn problems there and maybe some childhood issues that I need to unpack with a good therapist at some point. A lot of it, I think, was also just a general immaturity. I mean, I'm conscious that as a pale male, I had a very privileged upbringing, regardless of any issues. Grew up solidly middle class, never really felt, deprivation of any one thing. Obviously had a incredibly privileged schooling experience with opportunities galore, and then just sort of fast track through uni. And, the opportunity that came is very much me on the shoulders of many people behind me rather than anything to do with skill or talent.
Because I think you meant, I don't know whether you referenced it to yourself, but generally the people, in reference to my sporting stuff as well, that there seems that the high performers seem to be not necessarily screw loose, but looking to fill a void. But it seems to me that was, or maybe that was you, but now it's not. And is that a conscious shift, or is that something that because of your wife and people around you, like, and the kids obviously as well, to go, well, no, I don't want to, and the exposure to the patients, but very interested to know, because it obviously fueled you a lot. Yeah. But then you go on, you know what? I don't need to do that now.
Yeah, I think the void's a good analogy, because it definitely feels like if you just fill yourself with one more thing, or one more accomplishment or something else, another piece of paper, it will help fill whatever you're missing. I mean, imposter syndrome it's been studied endlessly in medicine as sort of a surrogate for, in quotation marks, sort of high-performing academic people, and none of us have any idea what's going on. It's been a recurring theme of conversation between my wife and I that even just when our kids started school and we were starting to meet other parents, we were just like, my God, none of these adults have any idea. Like, none of us are really adults. We're all just
grown-up kids.
It's like we're toddlers with the puppet masters of these adult bodies, and we're all just scared kids inside, and we all have our own individual issues.
Is that not the case?
And it's funny that you kind of imagine as a kid that adults have matured and grown and issues have resolved, but none of this is starting to get down a weird psychiatric and psychological tangent, but I feel like none of us really resolve as much stuff as we thought we would by the time we're adults. And so all the things that were problematic in high school with anxiety and imposter syndrome and wanting to be part of a group and the cool kids and not cool kids, all this kind of stuff seems to just persevere in adult life. And I think my wife being just perfect for me and complementing my autistic traits beautifully has probably helped center me a little bit and help fill the void. And then the kids coming along, obviously, you can't have too much of a void left once you have family. I think there's still a void there, obviously, because I do still have a tendency to overcommit and want to keep driving and keep doing new things. And I find it really hard to turn that part of myself off. And that's where I think I'm very lucky that my wife is honest enough just to say, what are you doing?
Bring you back to center.
Stop that. Don't, why are you taking on one more thing?
Yeah.
This is going to involve some sort of compromise to family life, and that's not okay.
I totally concur with all of that in my experience, and I'm very conscious of the pursuit is what sustains me, not the outcome. And so as long as I'm climbing the mountain, I'm stoked.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what drives me to do that, I'm not really sure. It's probably the same scared child in there as well to make sure that I feel like I'm to myself enough. And I don't know whether that'll ever be fulfilled. How has the care for yourself developed over time with your maturity?
So I think that's been a mix of, solid wife support, and we're both, I guess, very conscious about the impacts of our well-being in lots of different ways on children and family life in general and work. But part of it, I guess, our personal journeys, and in retrospect, sort of towards the end of my high schooling and certainly through university, I developed a pretty significant panic and anxiety disorder, which I had no idea what it was at the time. And like many high-performing and high-achieving kind of people, I just kind of stuffed it down inside and hid from it for a long time. But that impacted a lot of my engagement at university and made some of that more challenging than it otherwise needed to be, which was, it's funny because I'm looking at it from this side of things. I mean, I obviously did well enough at university to end up here. So, on the spectrum of any mental health disorder, how bad actually was it? I mean, I see people day in, day out who can't actually leave their house. And, so there are people out there suffering a lot more than I was. But I remember seeing my family GP at one point when I was about maybe 20, and I'd been going through a particularly bad run where I'd have sort of panic attacks and was struggling to be at university lectures because it was too confronting being sort of in a lecture theatre in front of people where I might embarrass myself and that kind of thing. And he looked at me, and at the time I was getting up at 4:30 to go and coach rowing. I was then doing a full day of uni, and then I was working from 3 p.m. until 11 p.m. In a warehouse to support myself financially. And he looked at me and just, I don't even remember what words he said, but the face that he gave me was just like, "You're an idiot. Like, what are you doing? What do you mean you're telling me you're feeling anxious? Yeah, no wonder."
Yeah.
And it was sort of this penny drop moment where I'm like, okay, maybe I've pushed myself a little too far here. And then it became really obvious to me, and I hadn't worked it out on my own, that actually, if I get a decent night's sleep and I exercise regularly and I take care of myself and I have social things as well as academic things to engage me, then actually, anxiety is no longer an issue. And I'm really lucky that probably over the last 15 years or so, it completely disappeared, and I'm a much more healthy person for it. But it was a really, just that wake-up call I was lucky to get from someone who I trusted well enough to take the obvious advice. Not sure I would have listened if it was anyone else. If a friend had said, "Geez, you seem like you're working a bit too hard," I'd be like, "No, that's fine. Right. I can do it. I am doing it." But
would you have done anything different, knowing what you know now, in terms of all the study and the experience and the Geelong and the Melbourne and the leaning in?
I think the short answer is probably no, because it's like the butterfly effect. Every flap of the wing and has landed me here, and I'm incredibly lucky where I've landed. In retrospect, I would probably be a better doctor if I'd been a bit more worldly, rather than rushing through university and working myself to the bone. Could have taken some more time, seen the world a bit more, done a bit of travel, learned a bit more about myself, and I might have got to a healthier balance a bit sooner in my life than I did. I may not have met my wife though, because not so ironically, I met her doing an extra shift that I'd picked up from a colleague. So
do you remind her of that?
Yeah. So
But for the workaholic.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, when it's meant to be, it's meant to be.
Yeah.
So I don't have any regrets. I think I'm very lucky. I've landed in such a fortunate space, and I've ended up with such a happy circumstance. But I certainly am different in the way I advise junior colleagues these days in terms of how important work-life balance is and how important it is to take time for yourself. And also the thing that isn't super clear when you come out of medical school, that you don't actually have to work yourself to the bone to get through. You can take your time and you will still get to the same place. It may just take a little bit longer.
So if you were in a lecture theatre full of med students, that's the message you'd be giving?
Yeah. Yep. Work smarter, not harder. Make sure you're a well-rounded human being, because, the old school doctor of 20-hour days and, surviving on, 60% of us being caffeine and the other 40% being, some dodgy sausage roll from the hospital cafeteria. It doesn't work anymore. It's not actually good care. It worked adequately for a whole generation, but I think the public deserve better from us, and they want doctors who have enough experience and enough compassion to relate to them as human beings, rather than just, here's your diagnosis, here's a pill, next.
With the hierarchy of the hospital, though, how important is mentorship to junior doctors? And like, you're there, the head of the top of the tree in that neurology unit. But what if there's other doctors, middle management doctors, I guess you want to call it, who are workaholics still, and they're not the best examples or not the best mentors?
We're pretty lucky these days. It's changed, even in my lifetime, it's changed a fair bit, but almost everybody, every junior doctor in the hospital, from an intern all the way up to people just before they become a specialist, all of them have educational supervisors and sort of more senior mentors that are consistent. So even doctors who rotate through multiple different services will usually have at least one person that's consistent through the year to bounce things off. In our own neurology in general, each of our neurology trainees has 2 or 3 educational supervisors who sort of periodically review their training and their progress, and their progress is humans as well as doctors, usually every 3 or 4 months. There's certainly less stigma from a junior doctor perspective in talking about mental health and work-life balance and those kind of things, which is really helpful. Like I sort of said before, the junior doctor population now are a lot more vocal in talking about what they want from work-life balance, and there's a much higher demand for part-time work and job share arrangements and adequate leave and all those kind of things, which previously medicine wasn't known for. So there have been a lot of positive changes. There are still the same challenges that every profession that attracts perfectionistic people, and that it can sometimes still be hard, even with less stigma, to actually get people to speak up. And sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes you can't pick it. And we have sadly seen at times junior doctors have horrendous problems, even to the point of losing their life and committing suicide. It's also been really well studied that the prevalence of mental health disorders in medicine is 50%. We're chronically depressed and anxious just because, to some degree, we put a warranted amount of burden on ourselves because some of our decisions are important, but we also sometimes have unrealistic expectations and particularly when people do what I did and just sort of run straight from school through uni, straight to medicine with no life experience and limited coping strategies, it sets you up for failure when the going gets tough.
Because you are dealing with really serious topics. I have important decisions to make and advices to give at my work, but at the end of the day, it's just, we're talking cash effectively, in various forms. And if someone loses a bunch of money, that's just what the game is. But For you guys, it's fatal, and it's unfair to some degree, and it's not warranted, and that must put a burden on you.
Definitely does. It's a bittersweet burden because, especially in my field where I'm not uncommonly telling people they have a terminal illness, I think it's important that I have a sufficient emotional range that I can be empathic with that process. And I think it would be strange if I was having those kind of conversations and not feeling anything. But at the same time, you want, especially with the younger generation, you want them to have sufficient coping skills that they're not taking it home and it's wearing them down and having a huge toll. And it's a fine balance. And, like many professions where there's a dark side to it, black humour is relatively common in all of medicine, as you might expect. Probably not as good as we should be at sort of healthy coping strategies, although we're getting better at debriefing and talking through problematic things. I'm very lucky and I'm hugely grateful that I'm not a surgeon because my capacity for causing harm is relatively limited. For most people, the biggest risk I have is making a misdiagnosis, and occasionally that can have really serious consequences, but it's a much more indirect harm than, doing open heart surgery and slipping and causing someone a lifetime of disability with a direct error. I'm a little bit sheltered. Does, I guess it all feeds into your perspective on life and what's important though, because, I have seen a lot of people die, and some of them in pretty horrendous ways where I've been there and seen stuff that you would not want to see. And other times where I've seen people pass with a huge amount of dignity and comfort and, really beautiful settings with loving families and things like that. And, to some degree you process the traumatic stuff, and I'm lucky that, I have a wife who had some healthcare experience and she's a great debriefer of me, so I don't tend to carry a heavy load. But it also really makes me appreciate that society at large doesn't talk very much about death, which is strange because it's
inevitable.
Apart from lawyers, it's the only thing that's universal in the world.
It is something that we're probably not taught to embrace or taught to discuss or process or manage. Any advice on how to work through that?
The main thing is really just to acknowledge that it's a reality, I think. And even our kids' relatively young age, my wife and I, not in a serious sit down and listen to us kind of way, but we often reference, when we're old and doddery, these are the kind of things that are important to us from a quality of life perspective. And especially for people who have chronic medical illnesses where it's known what the limits to their quality of life are. So people who've got already pretty significant conditions that limit their ability to do things. If the average person with brittle heart or brittle lungs gets COVID, for example, the likelihood of them doing well after a serious infection is pretty low. And so if they come into hospital, even if everything is done well, some medical conditions get a lot worse before they get better. And so if your loved one ends up at the point where it's a choice between an intensive care unit with a ventilator to see what happens or letting them go quietly, I suspect if you ask doctors 9 times out of 10 would be saying, we'll take the quiet option, thanks. There's a lot of things we do to people in medicine because we're too afraid to have the difficult conversation, and sometimes that's our fault because it is an uncomfortable conversation talking to someone and say, look, this is not something you're going to come back from, and we could do all these different things to you, but it's going to make your last days or hours pretty unpleasant. But part of it's also, I guess, society's expectation, the flashy TV shows where, either doctors get it wrong and it takes someone totally extraordinary to prove them all wrong and suddenly grandma's better again, or just a lack of awareness that Uncle Freddie at 89 with a broken hip probably shouldn't go to ICU to have his pneumonia treated because he's just not going to come back the same Uncle Freddie. And a lot of the time, unfortunately, those kind of discussions are a real surprise to families and people around.
Without those prior conversations, they don't want to be the ones responsible or carry that burden of that decision either.
Yeah, that's right.
Within the office we do the wills and estates department and enduring powers of attorney and advanced health directives, and they are great opportunities to have those discussions and say, in this scenario, this is what I want.
Yeah, and it's, medicine's kind of shot itself in the foot to some degree because we've portrayed this perception at large that we're actually very good and we heal the sick and we cure ills and we do really well. But if you look at it objectively, most of our treatments, aspirin's a good example. If someone has a stroke, I know that giving them aspirin is the best evidence-based treatment to minimise their risk of a future stroke. But actually, I need to give aspirin to 100 people to prevent a single stroke from happening. So for 99 out of that 100 people, I've done them absolutely no good, even though I'm giving them the best medical treatment. And there's a lot of things in medicine that are like that. So this notion that we can make a big difference is true sometimes.
For the 1 in 100.
Most of the time, it's nature. The illness takes its course and we help support people through it as best we can, but the body mostly does its thing regardless of our interventions. Tricky when the expectation is that actually we feel like we should have more control than we do.
That's at the same breath of the same podcast episode that we're making extreme advancements in neurology.
That's right.
And
It's
curing things that weren't curable or helping things that weren't able to be helped 10 years ago.
It's a weird duality, isn't it? Where there's some areas where I'm really optimistic and hopeful, but there are other areas where we just need to be better at having really frank discussions that, the natural history of a life is for it to come to an end. And, we don't often get to choose how we end, but realistically, as we all get older, and especially as the population gets older, we need to be better at having those discussions with our parents. What do they want? What does quality of life mean? Would they ever want nursing home care? Would they accept? What degree of disability would they accept? And parents having those discussions with kids. It's a bit of a stereotype that it's always the most distant relative who comes flying in the last 24 hours and says, "Stop, you've got to save him," just as everyone else has come to terms with their loved one coming to the end of their life. Clear and compassionate communication and a good understanding about where we're really helpful in medicine, but also where our limitations lie, and understanding that we see people at pretty tough times in their lives, and despite sometimes difficult experiences and certainly lots of mistakes, we're human just like everyone else. But, I struggle to think of any clinician I've ever met who wasn't doing it for the right reason. There's lots of other fields where we could, we certainly had enough academic skills to get into other areas where we could potentially have easier or more lucrative lives. So, most people in healthcare really care about what they do. It's a noble profession. Not noble necessarily, but, I think people, you have to care about what you're doing to want to stick it out. No one would do this just for the pay packet.
Outside of the patients that you see, let's talk about general public. Is there, what takeaways can we do to keep our brain healthier? What do you got for me?
Look, unfortunately, the boring stuff is still the best stuff. So, across almost every disease, without exception, physical exercise is the biggest fountain of youth that we know of. And that's true for dementia, and that's particularly topical because we are entering a new era where there are some anti-dementia therapies here and also some coming that are probably going to be reasonably exciting over our lifetime. So by the time you and I dement, we're probably going to be able to switch that off if we want to.
I don't have to go for a run after all this afternoon.
But, physical activity is a huge one. Metabolic health goes hand in hand with that. We know that the modern Western diet and exercise schedule and lifestyle is not really conducive to a long, healthy life. We're all a little overweight, eat the wrong things, too much processed food, and don't exercise enough. So if you just did those things simply, you're most of the way there. There's obviously a huge amount of momentum, particularly through social media and the internet, which is a wonderful resource in general, but there's a lot of things that people can access to try to improve brain health, whether it's apps on your phone that sort of brain training type things or specific supplements or funny powders or other machines. And the evidence for them is unfortunately more disappointing than we'd like. It's still...
There's no silver bullet yet.
Still no silver bullet. I do wonder, especially with AI and the way a lot of genetic medicine is going, that at some point, maybe a long way in the future, but I suppose at some point it's possible to conceive that you might have genetic tests to work out what your lifetime risks are, and you might have customized scans that help pick up problems before they develop and have a lot more preventative health than we currently do. But I suspect even in that age, it'll still be person A with a particular risk panel who exercises versus person B who doesn't. It's probably still going to be person A who does better.
Is that where AI is going in the medical field in terms of the very early diagnosis? And
to be honest, I'm not entirely sure because it's evolved so fast. I think it's caught a lot of us by surprise. So the main niche where it's really taking a load off at the moment is just in clinical documentation.
Sure.
So just the ability to have an AI scribe sit there and listen to a consultation and then write notes at the end means that we can much more effectively just focus on the person in front of us. And that's hugely helpful. There is an emerging literature that all else being equal, computer models are probably better diagnostically than human physicians. And that's probably because they're less prone to the human biases that we all have. And whether that will totally take over diagnostic reasoning, which I hope it doesn't, because that's a lot of the cognitive joy I get in my work, versus my hope is that we see it as an adjunct to human decision making, and you may get to the end of a consult and your little AI scribe might flag up a little, have you thought about this? And why don't you think about a scan of that? That would be a helpful adjunct. I guess the personalised medicine and genomic knowledge is kind of moving at a rapid rate of knots, and there's been a fair amount of publicity lately about pharmacogenomic testing where, particularly people with mental health disorders who have difficulty tolerating different antidepressants or antipsychotics, you can have a genetic panel that will try to help predict how your body handles various medications. And I can imagine that kind of thing rolling out more broadly might help us tailor therapies to individuals better, because it's still trial and error for a lot of things we do, where we know there are maybe 10 different therapies we could use and we pick one and we see how it goes, whereas in future we may be able to target that a bit better. The thing that I dread, that I really hope doesn't come to fruition, is the AI chatbot dispensing health advice, or you go to the GP surgery and there's no human there. It's just a robot and an MRI, and you get your bloods drawn and you get spit out with an answer. And I think even if that was 100% accurate and it provided the best possible health outcomes for people, I think we'd still miss the human touch. I think there's value still, even if I do nothing for a person, just having a human being sit there and listen to your story and empathise that, well, these are pretty crap symptoms and you're really going through it. And I get that you've lost your job because you've got motor neuron disease and your kids are distraught. And there's a human side to healthcare that I think is really important to preserve as the machines come along. And it's for that reason that every time I use an AI scribe, I always say thank you to the scribe, so it remembers me fondly when it takes my job.
Takes over the world. This has been great. I really, really appreciate it. Your eye contact has been pearl off, so really, that's just a lot of growth.
All that practice in the mirror has paid dividends. I'm going to go spend the evening alone now.
You can tell your colleagues you did so well. Before you go, 4 quick questions, because we've answered the middle one, but what does success mean to you?
I think, like I said at the start, success for me is no longer about personal achievements. I think if my kids grow up and they want to spend as much time with me as I do with them currently, that'll be a life well lived.
Happiness, what does that mean to you?
Happiness for me is mostly reflecting gratitude. I mean, everyone has their cross to bear and there are challenges. And I think that's also the universal thing I've seen. It doesn't matter the person who comes through my door. Every human being I see has some aspect of their life that's really hard for them, even if, we sort of compare ourselves to other human beings, and it's hard not to do that. But I think just that perspective and being aware that, I'm pretty lucky. I live in a pretty amazing place. I have a very happy family. I've managed to hold it together despite a pretty demanding job. My wife is stuck with me, and I don't have any significant medical illnesses that I know of yet until AI diagnoses me. So I'm very happy, I think.
A piece of advice you'd give to your younger self that you could put on a billboard for the world to see?
It's not about you, probably. I mean, I think we're all the protagonists of our own story, and as seriously as we take ourselves, we're all striving to do the best we can and provide the best life for families and kids and be good at work and be good to your colleagues. Everyone is in the same boat. We're all just so panicked about the same things. No one's actually looking at anyone else. So I think I would have been a much happier teenager and young adult if I knew that no one else really cared what I was doing. And I think that would have helped open me up to more opportunity a bit earlier, and maybe also shortcut my journey through anxiety issues.
And then finally, I guess that you think would be a good chat to have on the show next.
Well, I'm conscious you must have scraped the bottom of the barrel to get to me. So it's hard to know. Where do you go from here? Who could I invite on that would make me look good?
Sounds like your wife, to be fair.
I think she'd be a really interesting interview, but she's got ADHD and she doesn't like her medication, so she'd probably struggle to keep her in this room for very long. I mean, this is a very selfish ask, but I'd be really curious to hear from someone who's got lived experience of something awful that I see, like someone with, muscular dystrophy or motor neuron disease or something that their life circumstances changed on a dime. I'd be really interested to hear what success and happiness means for them. And the reason for that is because we know quality of life is surprisingly preserved. So, if you interview 100 people, most of us will say, I would never want to be quadriplegic. But if you then go and find a bunch of people who've had spinal injuries and have become quadriplegic, 100 of them will say, actually, my life is about the same as it was before. It's different, but
fulfillment and joy.
Fulfillment and joy, and there's an emotional resilience there when we're thrust into an unfamiliar circumstance. And I'm endlessly interested how the human spirit prevails and sees the bright side of what otherwise looks from the outside like pretty terrible circumstances.
Okay, sounds great. Dr. Antony Winkel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Proud of you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Keep doing the good work, and thank you for being so open with what we talked about. It's remarkable, but not surprising, the leaps and bounds of your career and that maturity of a human. One to be commended.
Appreciate you having me on, Rich.
That was another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. Next time you're doing brain surgery, turn to the person next to you and tell them all about the show. It really means a lot. A big thank you to Dr. Antony Winkel for sharing his experience and humility. If something in this episode resonated with you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, or just send us a message. Your support helps these stories reach more people. Until next time, peace.